Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Alex Petkas. Alex is host of the Cost of Glory podcast. He also holds a PhD in classics from Princeton. He teaches on persuasion, tradition, heroes, etc., influenced heavily by Plutarch's parallel lives. Alex, thank you for coming on the show. It's good to have you.
It's great to be here, Mr. Mershak.
Yeah. So you and I met a little while back, actually, in Austin, at a totally unrelated event. Actually, we were at the Knockchain at a Knockchain event, I believe,
Right.
with our friends over at Zork.
Hmm.
And I had probably seen you on Twitter. We're in sort of peripheral spheres before that, but I didn't know exactly what you did. And you told me a little bit about yourself and about the cost of glory. And since then, I've actually been kind of itching to have you on because the great books are one of the sort of one of my hobby horses. As someone who's no longer in the academic world and who works in tech and therefore encounters a lot of animosity towards the subject, I'm always itching to take the opportunity to sort of find someone who's a good expositor of their values, both individually as well as collectively. So I want to start by asking you about kind of the book that has been the epicenter of the Cost of Glory podcast in a lot of your work, which is Plutarch's Parallel Lives. Why Plutarch's Parallel Lives, and what about it do you think you are bringing to people in the modern day?
I gave a talk on this a little while back at Hillsdale, and I kind of made the contention. I think the title of my talk was Greco Futurism: a Revolutionist's Handbook. And I took that quote from a classical scholar who sort of, that's a phrase of Bernard Shaw, but he said, well, Plutarch is kind of like a revolutionist's handbook. And he's been at the center of a lot of political movements in the modern period that are kind of revolutionary. I mean, the Renaissance, Plutarch was a very influential person on Machiavelli, Ficino in his way, and the what he stands for. Of course, the American Revolution is probably the greatest example. I mean, he is the number one text from antiquity besides the Bible that all of the founding generation are reading. He's sort of the Emerson calls him a Bible for heroes, and characterizes him as a kind of gateway to all of antiquity. And also in the French Revolution, there's a famous murder of Marat. The guy in the bathtub with the towel on his head. You've seen the
Mm.
painting. He was kind of a vicious Jacobin, and this girl Charlotte Corday came to Paris to murder him and assassinate him. And she was seen earlier that day carrying around a copy of Plutarch's Lives, which contains many accounts of people assassinating tyrants. So I think it's a really interesting book for our times because it's it's a collection of biographies,
Mm.
uh, biographies of Greeks and Romans put in parallel to compare them against each other. There's short, sort of bite-sized, 40, 50, 60 pages maybe in modern editions mostly. And people like Alexander, Caesar, Cicero, Pericles, Spartan kings. And Plutarch's goal in writing it was to kind of spur you on to virtue, to excellence. And I think that's both in the sort of more normie sense. He wants you to cultivate the four cardinal virtues: justice, temperance, wisdom, and courage. But it's also valid for the more classical, archaic Machiavellian sense of virtu, or the
Mm.
Homeric arete, or what the Romans around Caesar's time, a guy like Sallust would just call virtus. It's just like overwhelming manly excellence. Plutarch also kind of wants to inspire you with that too. And he's been, incredibly influential in many periods, but has sort of fallen off of our radar today culturally. And I kind of picked him as the center of my project a few years ago when I was starting The Cost of Glory shortly after I quit academia because I wanted to do, and I'm this is still my mission. I wanted to do what other people have done for Stoicism for Plutarch to kind of bring him back into the center of the cultural conversation. And that'll look a lot different than writing popular books about emotional management and stuff like that. Plutarch is not like a he's not like a handy maxim full. He's got a lot of handy maxims, but that to really kind of bring him to life, you just gotta retell his stories and make people kind of love these incredible men of power that he talks about. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my show. Um,
Yes, and uh, were you surprised that there was a thirst for this kind of narratives today? I mean, as you
yeah,
said, there lots of great men throughout history have revered Plutarch, and yet in modern day times, we almost feel as if heroes don't exist. The possibility of heroism is sort of foreclosed to us. It's something of the past.
yeah. I think that's precisely why people like this stuff and are, the traction I've gotten to me is proof of that hypothesis that people are thirsty for something grander. And it's like, I've been reading Rusty Reno's book, Death of the or Return of the Strong Gods. And he talks, I think he coined this term. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But this idea of the post-war consensus where the left and the right kind of, they're both versions of liberalism where the goal is sort of to um, disenchant and make people think smaller to get them interested in like, sexual experimentation and multiculturalism and just to kind of weaken the strong gods that brought about the world wars, which you can see their reasoning back in the 40s and the 50s. But it's done this work of kind of removing our sense of heroism and our reverence for ambition and great plans and great schemes and that those are just like deep parts of human nature, especially for men.
Yeah.
And so I think it is timely, and there are other more spicy internet influencers that are recommending Plutarch to the young men, right? Nietzsche um, talks about you know young men need to read Plutarch. Satisfy your souls on Plutarch. Believe in yourselves when you believe in his heroes. 100 such men educated against the modern grain who have learned to desire, to appreciate and desire the heroic, could silence now and forever the whole noisy pseudo education of our era. That's way more true today, I think, than it was in Nietzsche's day. So, there it is timely, I think, even though it takes work to kind of get people to see what it's all about for sure.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about your to just pontificate on the nature of this thirst that men have in
Hmm.
particular, which is it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to read these books, I'm going to draw inspiration from them. It's entertainment at the least, education as well. Um, but you know, most of us are not in a macro political situation where a lot of their anecdotes are going to be that applicable, right?
Hmm.
We live in modern nation states with complex governments, state structures, and militaries, and for most, the overwhelming majority of men, the options available for, daring conquest or even political intrigue seem quite limited. That being said, there is something deeper going on with this thirst that's not just like I'll compare it to Stoicism. So the
Hmm.
Stoicism sort of revival that's happened over the last several decades is kind of sold as a self-help manual from the past, right? Where Stoicism's whole goal is to kind of help you cope with the limited nature of your humanity, and giving you tools for that. And so it gets branded as, okay, life is hard. You're going to go through difficult times. Here's a toolkit we can bring from the past that will help you do this. It's not clear to me that this striving in Plutarch's lives has a purely utilitarian aspect. That is, there does seem to be a an exhortation towards a vision and a long-term goal, but it's unclear what the steps are along the ways, and it's also obvious that that goal can be uh, brought up to date to any kind of modern situation, whether that's building a business or something else. Um, all of this is to say, I want to ask you about the difference between this sort of utilitarian framing of these things and this kind of deeper question that I think is might be part of human nature that you hinted at.
Yeah, I think the governing emotion that makes Plutarch's lives and stuff like it appealing is this thing that Aristotle talks about in the rhetoric, zeal, zelos. It's often translated as emulation. The pain a man feels when he sees present in others who are like him by nature, things good and honorable which he himself is capable of attaining. So Plutarch is the author of all the classical authors, the one who zeal, that word, occurs the most in his corpus. He's constantly talking about zeal, the imitative drive. It's not just imitation, it's the desire to imitate. And it works across time and space. It is kind of mimetic rivalry on some level. So, you know, there is maybe a connection to be made with Rene Girard, but it's much more the positive aspects of this, like um, that this is our fundamental approach to the past. Nietzsche talks about it as monumental history, the history that is the most important mode. There are other modes. There's the critical mode. Um, there's the kind of antiquarian mode, but the monumental mode is the one in which we kind of look to history and the details of this or that law or this or that, economic condition can sometimes we can kind of TLDR that. Yeah, 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 sure, sure. But we're really interested in these examples of men like striving greatly, fighting against their times. Julius Caesar taking on the entire Roman establishment, the Spartans of Thermopylae. This kind of like energy that you get from the past is what monumental history is all about for Nietzsche. And Plutarch is, to compare with Stoicism, Plutarch has a lot in common. Like there's a lot that is just basic good wisdom about how to deal with emotions, anger and greed, and how to deal with things that you can't control. Don't try to control things that are not within your sphere of concern. Try to focus on what you can actually do. A lot of kind of shared wisdom across the philosophical tradition. But Plutarch is a philosopher first and foremost. That's worth pointing out. But he's a philosopher of the Platonic tradition. So, I mean, he's writing 400 years or so after Plato dies. He's a Greco-Roman guy, late first century AD. But he has I think that in general, the Platonists just have a much more coherent metaphysical system and a way than the Stoics do. And like later Neoplatonism actually took up the majority of Stoic ethics, but just like kind of sat it kind of in the lap of an expansive Platonist metaphysics, which is hierarchical. Like there are lower forms, higher forms. There's lower, when you get into late Neoplatonists like Proclus. There's just like all these hierarchies of gods, daimons, angels, gods, the supreme God, and then the one, the essence is beyond being. And there's a sense in which nature is looking up itself. Every aspect of nature looks up to a higher ideal that it aspires to be like. Goes right back to the many Platonic passages, the symposium, the ladder of love, and how you start to desire another person, and then you can kind of realize that there are other higher things that you can desire that maybe build upon that, the desire for honor, and the greatest is the desire for wisdom. Um, and that these higher essences kind of pull us up. And I think they believe that metaphysically, and there's a lot of comparisons to make with Christianity. But it also kind of explains the the social hierarchy and kind of explains why it's good and why how like what it's supposed how it's supposed to function. A leader is supposed to draw up everybody below him
Hmm.
to a higher ideal, a higher example. He's supposed to kind of fix his gaze on the eternal truths. Maybe he doesn't think of them as eternal truths, but like solid principles, like justice. Like a really effective leader will like embody the highest human virtues, and that's his greatest strength. He and people see that, and they want to not just follow him, but be like that. The good ones among them. And I think Platonism has a great ethical system, but this kind of metaphysics where you can explain um, why society is ordered the way it is, and why hierarchy is a positive thing, and how to leverage that power, how to find yourself in that hierarchy, and ascend it if you're called to that, and inhabit the station that you do with the most excellence. Like that's all. Uh, it is a bit countercultural today. Like Stoicism is easy to kind of scrape clean of its metaphysics, like you know, the eternal return of the fire consuming everything, and you don't see Ryan Holiday talk about the logos a whole lot, but um, yeah, he will a little bit, I guess. But Platonism is just a lot. It's easy to kind of slot Stoicism into where people were reading, New Age Buddhist pot, and maybe they're still reading that, but there's also like sticking a little Stoicism in there. And I think Plutarch is it's a more challenging sell or a more challenging kind of life to take on. It's like because it's a higher calling, it really does say, all right, what are you doing? Is this the highest thing you could be doing? You know? And that's too much for a lot of people. But I think there's a lot of young men, I think, but even people, older than me, who really feel the lack of that calling and want something to aspire to. And that's what Plutarch has been for generations and generations of the kind of leadership classes of Europe and the West. So, um, but he does appeal. The story of Sertorius buying off the brigands in the Alps because his friends were like, these guys are pipsqueaks. You could take a man. And he's like, no, no, no. This will cost me one day, and getting one day's advantage on the real enemy that I care about. The armies of the Optimates. They're chasing me down. That's worth it.
Yeah.
There's nothing more valuable for a leader than time. Things like that. Like there are a lot of lessons that you can take that apply, I think, in business as well. Because, business is so much of success in business is like correctly identifying human nature, right? And so these lessons kind of come up again and again. And I think that, it's just like the kind of 80s corporate raider with Sun Tzu on his shelf. Like, the art of war really does kind of inspire you with the kind of energy that you need to kind of be the contender out in the ring or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you briefly about this do a comparison to Machiavelli. So Machiavelli wrote The Prince, Discourses on Livy. The Prince, most famously, is a mirror for princes. And Plutarch's Lives seems to be functionally used in the same way, but is not a mirror for princes. Can you talk a little bit about the difference there?
Yeah. Machiavelli's a little bit more prescriptive. Um, I do put Plutarch in the mirror for princes tradition. So
Hmm.
there is a passage that where he talks about, I think it's in the life of Timoleon. He says, I began writing my lives for the sake of others, but I find that I am staying in it and enjoying it for my own sake also, using history as a mirror he uses that metaphor. You know, and he talks about kind of welcoming these men into his house, these like great dead figures from the past, seeing how they did their daily business and kind of living with them for a while. But that metaphor of history as a mirror is, a mirror is something. What do you see in a mirror? Yourself. It's a tool for reflection, right?
Hmm.
And if you look at George Washington, and then you try to see yourself in George Washington, you're gonna see, oh, that's what I should look like, but this is what I look like now. I gotta change something. I gotta work on my traps. George Washington had big traps. I gotta work on my traps, whatever it is. My courage in battle or statesmanlike demeanor and things like that. So, as for Machiavelli, great admirer of ancient virtu, and he uses a lot of the similar kind of like language that suggests he's in the same spirit. This idea that we need to imitate the ancients. Is this in the discourses on Livy? I forget where it is, but where I think it's maybe the Prince, where it's okay. Aiming at Caesar is aiming really, really high, but it's just like shooting an arrow, right? Like you
Right.
try to get a target that's so far away, you aim way higher, and then your arrow will eventually hit the target because you aimed higher. Um, there is a sense that Plutarch is he's a lot less he can present you with these incredible cold-blooded Machiavellian figures like Sulla, Lysander of Sparta, the guy who defeated Athens and installed the 30 tyrants. And he can kind of depict them so sympathetically, even though he'll eventually say, ah, yes, but Lysander, here's where he went wrong, or Sulla ended up you know, like wasting away in drunkenness and idleness and kind of spoiled his legacy, I think, in Plutarch's eyes by being too vindictive when he won. But he can still kind of admire the grandeur of the man. And so he can kind of have his cake and eat it too. Machiavelli gets blamed for being, this advocating injustice when necessary. And Plutarch doesn't have to do that, but he can show you instances of people doing that and it
Right.
turning out
Right.
okay for them. Uh, so, uh, so that I think he's for that reason. Last thing I'll say, he is a great, safe choice for the kind of normie. I just want to be a good citizen person, but he's also this powerful tool for the people who want to really climb to the top and are willing to do what it takes. Plutarch will give you that too if you want it. You just know what you're getting into. He'll warn you. Just it's a jungle out there. It's a greasy pole, and there's beasts at the top. So I like that about him. It is very truthful in that way.
Yes. So we've been talking so far about, your work bringing Plutarch's lives to tons of people through your show and kind of the role that it plays in injecting energy right into an otherwise maybe stagnant or enervated life that many of us seem stuck in. Um, and you mentioned archaeofuturism. When I reached out to you, and actually when we spoke the first time, I believe we talked about the topic of archaeofuturism. Now it's been a while since I've read the book of the same name, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about the concept of archaeofuturism, and then maybe move into aesthetics. And in particular, I'm interested in this idea of using the past as energy in some kind of synthesis with the present day to sort of perpetuate us into the future. It's clear that the gifts from the past that we have not yet been exhausted. So tell me a little bit about your view on archaeofuturism and how it relates to this concept of energizing us.
Yeah, for me, it started out as kind of an observation of things that I saw going on in the memosphere. My friend Pablo Peniche was posting these AI generated images of beautiful futuristic interiors in the what he called the Greco futurist style. I
Hmm.
love that. I think he coined that term. So Greco futurism is one way to talk about archaeofuturism that gets away from the sort of known political connotations of Guillaume Faye and the Archeofuturism, which is very toxic French right wing writer in France, but a very interesting thinker, kind of a wacky dude. But he's pointing to something that runs very deep, I think, in Western culture. Again, it's these revolutionary moments. These people who are really imagining a grand destiny for their own nation, and they have a revolution. And they're often Plutarch's by their side, and or the ancients more general. And you see this in sci-fi too, right? Like Dune. This is very archaeo-futuristic aesthetic. I was talking with pseudonymous John Carter, notes from Barsoom's Substacker, and asked him why he thought that was, and he said, "Well, this was a high point civilizationally for Western culture. We always like look back to the high points, and I think it's because we look back to these high points and try to outdo them, try to kind of emulate them, and it's about archaeofuturism in general. I think a lot of it is about looking as far back into the past as we want to look into the future,
Hmm.
recreating something that will be remembered as a high point, that tends to be technologically, economically, politically, morally ambitious. It's just a really hard thing to pull off. And so you know, you see this in the like the founding architecture of the US. It's not looking back to Georgian England, right? It's looking back to Rome or Greece. The classicism is like a statement. This is the new thing that we're going to do. Um, it's just like a very kind of aggressive, ambitious, optimist sort of vision. So I noticed these memes, it's like Elon Musk is tweeting about how he loves the Iliad and the Odyssey. Just the other day, he tweeted about Xenophon's Anabasis. Awesome. And I also was paying attention to the Vesuvius challenge,
Hmm.
the deciphering of the Herculaneum papyri that were buried by Vesuvius using extremely high res particle accelerator X-ray scans and AI to digitally unwrap these things, these like, you know, several, what do they call them? Petabyte, I don't know, whatever is after terabyte, um, scans of these scrolls and get the text of the text that have never been read in 2000 years. So, and there just seems to be like a lot of energy out there on the internet, at least, for the American dynamism, techno optimism, and there's a lot of factions within those groups, or at least within the techno optimist group, and simultaneously from a lot of the same people, kind of re-enchantment with the idea of classical Greece and Rome, and I think a lot of that's coming from the Caribbean rhythms section of the the peanut gallery, which is awesome, and so it seems like it, but I think it's a platform that unites futurist economic industrial energy and artistic energy, the creative, the possibilities with respect for tradition in a qualified respect for, a tradition insofar as it serves the future, right? Like, okay, we're not trying to press pause or press rewind, but in going back to the tradition, we're trying to find, we're going to mine it for stuff that we can use. And I think that also the archeo part of archaeofuturism for Guillaume Faye is about grounding futurist projects in a real clear understanding of human nature. In I think in a strong metaphysics, I think it's one of the things that's really been a real driver of stagnation. It's kind of oxymoronic phrase to use, but it's been a real roadblock, mental block for us for the 20th century. This idea of uh, the post-war consensus and like the death of the strong gods and like no metaphysical aspiration, like no sense of like a greater destiny for a nation or for a religion or for humankind as a category. Like we really need these things and Archeofuturism or Greco-futurism, as I prefer the term, points a direction to grounding these things in a common set of symbols and a common set of values and like a strong sense of like what humans are and what they should be building, like the polis, the man is a political animal from Aristotle, things like this, the metaphysical hierarchy of Platonism. Like there's a lot of really strong scaffolding to build very ambitious, very futurist projects there. And if we can start mining it together, and a lot of people have started, and you see Anglo-futurism out there. People are getting interested in Marini again. There's a lot of cool articles on IM 1776 coming out. Stephen Pimentel, a friend of mine, just published one today on what's the guy's name? Anyway, check it out. Yeah, so think people are starting to look this direction, and so I think the tech community is really receptive. Actually, the book Boom by Tobias Huber and Bern Hobart is another one. Its way. Alex Karp's book, The Technological Republic,
Yeah.
has at least the makings of openness to an alliance based on Greco-futurism. So it's like a potentially big tent that we can base a lot of future institutions and artistic movements on. So let's throw some fire on it.
I wanted to ask you about the aesthetics of Archeofuturism. We
Mm,
were talking earlier about Neoplatonism, and when you think about this sort of burgeoning, I do agree that it's a good Schelling point for a burgeoning alliance between these various factions. And the aesthetics of it are an interesting component because what you have is you have a reverence for things like order, symmetry, hierarchy, and these are all clean lines, Roman columns. Uh,
very fascistic, right?
well,
According to the
let's leave the
the
political affiliations
yeah, no,
aside
yeah,
for a
for
moment.
sure.
Um, these are in themselves values, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that they can be expressed aesthetically. And I think it's also interesting that if you to consider what they might point to, given that our general culture is sort of, at least in the art, in terms of the artistic expression, it's antithetical to everything traditional. All art must be, must be transgressive, must be ugly in many cases, disorderly, no clean lines. Everything must not look like anything that has come before. There's also a kind of rejection of form in itself. And the aesthetics of any kind of, Greco-futurist or Archaeo-futurist, whatever term you want to put on it, um, seems to fly in the face of all of that. And it's also this notion that we could bring this stuff back, and it's not merely a kitsch representation of the past, but that it actually, can be incorporated in a useful way today. Another movement that's similar to this and shares some of these qualities is like Art Deco, which I'm a huge fan of, and
Yeah.
also has sort of a history and an association with capitalism and kind of more right wing thought in art. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit, like what do you think about the aesthetics and what that says?
Yeah, it's well, it's funny, like the moment we start talking about aesthetics, I instinctively was like, it's fascist, but I was obviously kidding, but I think that's one of the things that like instinct to see order and symmetry and hierarchy as politicized terms is a product of the kind of cultural sickness that we've had that has held back a lot of creativity, and it's very anti-zeal.
Right.
Because artists are like good artists have to spend a lot of time copying other artists, like how you learn in a lot of ways, and creating a new work of art, a novel work of art, is historically has been a kind of respect for the way that it was, but kind of enough transgression to be new, but also enough respect that you're building on something that came before, and that the people kind of can see a movement. Now it's like a bunch of unspooled cassette tapes on the floor of a boring museum, and somebody pees on it. It's like as performance art. Well, that doesn't connect to anything. It's all words, and there's no respect for what came before. There's no sense of learning. There's no human craftsmanship in so much of the art that we see. So um, I I do I do like seeing pictures of beautiful, you know, Renaissance cathedrals and great buildings. Why can't you build like this, Western man, on Twitter? But I also think that there should be room for striking, bold creativity in a Greco-futurist world. And I mean, Art Deco is certainly one of my favorite styles, Art Nouveau, and it comes from this period of like high futurism, so much of it, the kind of pre-World War One Europe and America. It's a much more optimistic time. Maybe some would say decadent, but you know, people like Marinetti were very plugged in with you know the Art Deco kind of vibe, and I think he would have taken it even further. But and that's it's a very kind of classicizing futurism, the Art Deco, and I think that there's just a lot of possibilities, and you kind of need to leave it to artists to create them, and especially in the kind of like dissident discourse, which tends to get so politicized so quickly, like let people experiment um and have your own aesthetic response before you try to kind of have a political response to it.
Mm.
Um, but but it's going to take a lot of effort to restore the trades of art and the craftsmanship, and there's so much, especially in the visual, um like painting and drawing. There's so much to incentivize you to not learn those skills, with AI art being so easy to reproduce. Sculpture, a lot of people are doing interesting things with sculpture, the stone cutting startups, which I think is really cool. But um, I think the most impactful genres are the narrative genres, the the theater, movies. I think long form podcasts, books, uh, sci-fi. I'd like to see these take off, and that aesthetics are a little bit more complicated in that realm, but complementary, right? Like
Mm.
there should be a kind of ferment of artists talking to each other and experimenting, and it's enough to be kind of conversant in the classics. You don't have to. They don't prescribe a way forward necessarily, right? Like um, so many people online are quick to jump on brutalism, and I think most brutalism sucks, but there's some interesting stuff. The um, what's it called? Anyway, there's a complex in London that is a brutalist complex, but it's very like filled
I
with
know, I know
nature.
the
The
one you're
Barbican,
referring to.
the
Yeah.
Barbican, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cool stuff. So I hope that we as a kind of an aesthetic movement can preserve that sense of a big tent openness and wackiness as we go forward.
I'm going to ask you before we leave this the aesthetics, and I know you just said you're a fan of the narrative form more so, but I'm going to ask you to perform a little trick for me, which is to psychologize the concept of futurism. And
Mm,
the reference I have for the inspiration for this is a lot of this conversation so far has reminded me of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, right? Where he's
yes.
talking about the Apollonian and the Dionysian elements in Attic theater. And he posits that the Greeks sort of constructed this dream world as an almost to mediate between the harshness of their own reality. And given that as the context for, this is Nietzsche's discussion of aesthetics. What do you think it points to when a culture is moving through a futurist mode? Because obviously
Mm.
futurism waxes and wanes. There are lots of periods where we're not very concerned with the future. There are other periods where it becomes more prominent. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about what that means, how that reflects on the culture of the time, given that people are in the last several years tremendously more interested in futurism.
That's a fascinating question. Well, I'll do some free association here. When I think of the birth of tragedy, I mean, Nietzsche does talk about this dream world, but uh, it's also like tragedy is this confrontation with like sublime forces of terror that can just destroy you at a whim, which is kind of this kind of cheerful pessimism that the Greeks have, which I think Nietzsche would say that this comes from a just a like very harsh, honest confrontation with constant war, the likelihood that you'll die, and that kind of that liberating feeling of, well, can't get worse than this. Um, and and so I wonder, and I don't know the pre-World War One period that well, but I wonder if people were kind of afraid, you know? Like they had the Franco-Prussian War, the US Civil War that had just really revealed how horrifically deadly modern guns can be. And it had been a long period, the Belle Epoque, since the 1870s. No big wars, maybe like a feeling that things were brewing, that things could get really bad. I don't know. I do feel that there is a sort of sense that we hit rock bottom in the COVID era, like a deep distrust with the way things were set up by our government, the way things are set up in society, that makes you really dwell on, really be determined to change it, you know? Um, so that's a short answer. I'm interested in your thoughts too, because I mean,
Yeah,
we're both working with similar canvases.
yeah. Well, given that I posited the question and it was a little bit of a curveball, I'll answer my own question. Um, yeah, I think it does reflect a kind of reaction to pessimism,
Hmm.
right? Which is like sort of like if we can just envision a grand, tremendous, optimistic future. It's a kind of escapism, but
Hmm.
it's not pure escapism because it actually does entail requisite action, right?
Hmm.
Um, and if you compare it to say there's like I don't know if you've read Zero to One, but there's like Thiel's chart of definite, indefinite optimism and pessimism, right? It's
Yep.
kind of reinvigoration of definite optimism.
Yes.
Um, and in that sense, it's hopeful, but I think it does have this pessimistic undertone where it's like
Hmm.
we need to escape the future, the AI future where we're all just, wire headed in, you know, eating bugs and living in the pod. How do we do that? Well, the best bet that we have is Elon Musk. Like the best bet that we have is like strong, high modern, definite optimism, as opposed to the indefinite optimism of like the boomers or the definite pessimism of say like the Chinese.
Hmm.
This is all Thiel's framing. Um, so that's my best guess at an answer to it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think that's really this the sense that the future could go very, very wrong if we're not careful seems to be a real energy field that we're tapping into. And James Poulos talks about this with Bitcoin monasteries is kind of catchphrase he uses. But this idea that the only thing that could possibly save us from the AI singularity and like the totalitarian threat that's coming, and not just that, I mean, it could be a very decentralized sort of totalitarianism of like constant porn, just like frying kids' brains. Like the only thing that's going to save you from that is is a really strong like character, moral foundation, and he would say, religious seriousness. Like it's going to be an act of God. The grace of God is going, and I think that this kind of somewhat real. I mean, it seems real to me. This real turn toward interest in great spiritual traditions again is connected with this, and again, he's trying to kind of say that that's a good thing, and we should lean into that. Um, that that there's a lot at stake. Um, and I think that there's room for serious religious engagement in Greco-Futurism. I mean, the Greeks were really religious, I mean, in a very, very different way, right? Like, but they had no doubt that the gods were real and that you needed to sacrifice to them, and then it meant a lot. And I think that sense of a higher power that we should pay attention to is is welcome. I'm not saying it's mandated by archeofuturism, but it's like it fits in there pretty happily among probably the radical atheists in there as well,
Yeah, right, right. Or the pagans.
or the pagans. Yeah, hopefully they're
Um,
pagans and not radical atheists. I don't know what's better, but I like pagans.
so let's talk a little bit about one of your other programs, which is the Rostra. Is it
Hmm.
Rostra? Uh,
Yeah, Rostra, that's fine. Hmm.
yes. There's a lot of talk, especially in my circles, about groups for men, ways for men to congregate and improve themselves, and et cetera, clubs, private clubs, retreats, whatever. Um, and so I just want to ask you a little bit about, let's first go over what it is, and then I want to ask you some more questions about who it typically attracts and what kind of changes people are there for.
Yeah, we started doing retreats first. My good friend and business partner, Eric Hewitt, and I, uh, 3 years ago, maybe. And we did them in Rome. My past academic background, before I left academia, was I spent a lot of time in the summers doing these kind of retreat like Greek and Latin, especially Greek language instruction programs, and they were philosophical in spirit, and we'd get around a table and talk about Homer or Plato in Attic Greek, and it was really really fun and really really weird, very very self-selecting group. That was the high point. It was 2 weeks a year, the high point of my year. Loved it. Made great friends. And I had the sense starting the podcast that, we could create something that built on that experience. And so we started doing these Rome trips that were all men. And so far all of our programs are all men, partly because, well, in my experience in the kind of para-academic world, we had seen that having women involved just puts a ceiling on certain things. Like there's just stuff you can't do. When women will often get really suspicious of male friendships, especially if there's like um, a hierarchy involved in which some of the instructors are whatever. Yeah, I mean, you could go into details about how it can kind of poison the well, or if you're trying to have men's camaraderie and women are around, it doesn't work. There's three kinds of spaces, human sociologically. There's men's spaces, women's spaces, and mixed spaces. And over the course of the 20th century, we gradually eradicated all of the men's spaces, except for the most part, locker rooms and sports, with obvious like asterisk blip of the past few years, which I think we're getting rid of. But um and that they're gone. The social clubs that used to be these great, powerful political societies in California and New York and all over, and the Turner Vereins, the men's athletic movements, the gymnasium in ancient Greece is where philosophy was born. It was a physical place for physical training. It was by definition is a public space. It's like men only. They're naked. That's maybe optional in kind of men's gathering situations. We don't do that. But that's where philosophy is born, getting guys together for like serious conversation. There's just not a lot of these spaces. Okay, everybody knows that. So what I wanted to do was to have a space that's dedicated to the skill that is the classic skill of statesmanship and leadership for the Greeks and the Romans, and that's rhetoric. Has kind of mixed connotations today, of course. So sometimes we'll call it statesmanship, but essentially, the quintessential like training that you would undergo as an aristocrat, as an upper class Roman or Greek, or as a lower class person trying to strive up higher, would be to get a training in the art of persuasion, or addressing a crowd, writing well, also very important. And that process of becoming a great speaker is the basis of classical education. It's why there is a canon in the first place of great books. It's because there's a kind of set of touchstones of great men, first and foremost, that you're trying to emulate, that you find in those texts, in the stories of Thucydides and Plutarch, and even Plato's dialogues, or the histories of Sallust. There's a kind of set of men that you're trying to emulate, and a set of kind of linguistic models that you're trying to shape your own thought, your storytelling powers, your ability to turn a phrase. You're sort of shaping yourself around these men and these texts, these kind of aesthetic models of eloquence and persuasion. And through that process, there's a kind of a personal transformation that happens. And it's very much a kind of it's a moral formation too. Moral philosophy is part of the training of a statesman. And it's really kind of a subset of rhetoric in a lot of ways. But most philosophy teachers in antiquity paid their bills by teaching rhetoric. This is the business model of higher education in antiquity. You teach rhetoric. If you want to learn about the forms and the unity of the virtues and the blah blah blah, find a philosopher, get your dad to pay for the rhetoric education. Okay, you can go be a lawyer, you can go be a bureaucrat, maybe you can be a general, but you might be there to study the higher ideas, but you have to have a practical education. So there's this whole kind of thought world around rhetoric and what it can do for you as a man. It's in a lot of ways like the classical art of manliness is like manly formation and kind of public forming your public persona and being able to relate with people of all classes, people from different cities. And I see this as a real desideratum among the right, And I mean, certainly that was one of the things that attracted me about the classics. I mean, I am very much not uh, by disposition or by nature like a professional talker a um, or eloquent by nature. And so when I was an undergrad, I was really attracted to this aspect of the classics that I kind of sensed was part of the thing. And it's kind of not emphasized in most classical schools and departments, but I sense that this is like why the fathers turned to this stuff, why the great orators were steeped in the classics is about kind of becoming a grander, more, you know, more eloquent, articulate, thoughtful, intelligent, really person version of yourself. Um, and so I think that it's a desideratum also because on the right, whatever that means, there is, and the online world in general, there's this tendency for people to get really good at talking to their audience and to representing their own perspective and kind of memeing the thing that's going to get the likes. And rhetoric, a lot of rhetoric is about reaching across the aisle and about like learning to present yourself well before a tough crowd that doesn't agree with you. And that's kind of hard to do unless you really try hard on the internet. And Julius Caesar, I mean, he's a based right-wing revolutionary or something. I mean, of course, he's a populist in Roman politics. He's a sort of on the Roman left, but you know, that guy was a really reasonable guy. He was really good at making the his opponents look kind of like alarmist kooks, and he's really good at winning over the moderates. Hey, we're all Romans here, that's part of his just devilishly good talent at rhetoric and his mastery of politics because he's a great kind of suave persuader who knows how to kind of argue both sides of the case and not alienate his opponents if he doesn't have to and things like that. So that's a whole mouthful about the kind of general theory behind it.
Well,
Um, but we also have, concrete things that we do.
I I want to emphasize here this component of speaking in person, right?
Hmm.
And often extemporaneously.
Key. Yes.
Um, so those are two different things. But there's a similar dynamic with comedians where and I remember them talking about this when COVID happened because a bunch of comedy clubs got shut down. And
Hmm.
the comedians can't really do a stand-up comic can't really do his work in isolation because you only know if the joke is going to land on a given audience when you're in front of them. And you're going to have a different audience every night. And so some nights you're going to be off. Some nights they're not going to vibe with you. Maybe they have a problem with your politics, whatever. And the sort of journey of all comedians is to kind of like push through and get to a level of mastery where you can go on basically any stage and do well, whether they know who you are or not. And I feel like there's an analogy here in the art of rhetoric, which is increasingly lost when you compare them to sort of online content creators. And admittedly, I myself, almost all the content I've made has been online. I've done some speaking. Um, you have the same dynamic. It's almost like there's not a proper feedback loop between yourself and the online world because in the online world you just get selection for the kind of people who are interested in your content, whereas in the real world you know it you don't know what you're going to get. And so your level of skillfulness, artistry, mastery, flexibility has to really be taken up a notch in order to be an artful and persuasive speaker. But I just want to, before I close this sort of uh, point, I just want to emphasize to people listening, think about the power that comes to someone who's able to get in front of a crowd and persuade them of their point of view and do so extemporaneously, right? And even in the extreme case you said where maybe a lot of them are opponents of that view. They're coming in already having made their mind that they disagree. That's an extraordinary skill, and it's useful in any kind of leadership position.
Totally. Yeah, and it's kind of like you said with comedians. I mean, you could be a comedian on a Zoom call with 500 people, and you tell the same joke, and it's not going to land because laughter is contagious. There's a social element to it. There's a kind of immediate feedback loop, like those like seconds or milliseconds really count. Um, and persuasion is the same way. It's uh, the kind of mood of a crowd and what it feels like to talk to 300 people at once. I was just giving a speech at the NatalCon conference last weekend, and rare that I ever speak in front of that many people at once, and it was really fun. It's exhilarating, and um and so this is a thing that we used to have institutions for, actually, in across the West. I have called them men's speaking societies on the Rostra web page, the page on the costofglory.com. And there are smaller versions of this, the Greek symposium, the kind of uh, philosophical retreats of Roman senators you see depicted in Cicero's dialogues. There's the Leather Apron Club, the Junto or Junto, whatever Ben Franklin's club was. There's the Lyceum Society where Lincoln gave this famous speech. We used to have men's speaking societies, and they didn't have to be called men's. They were just sort of like de facto, probably only men going to be there, or maybe it was mandated. Okay, maybe there's flute girls there in the Greek Symposium, but they're not really part of the social group. And when you get men together to talk about serious subjects, you kind of, if even if it's a small group, you might have a heterogeneous group of guys that are all friends, but there's plenty of stuff that you don't all agree on, and you need to like measure your words. And I think even on our retreats, we'll have 15, 20 people in the room and doing impromptu speeches, maybe at dinner, maybe at breakfast, and having to speak extemporaneously or preparedly, doing a debate in front of that kind of crowd. It's like it's not an experience you get a lot of, right? And what my the kind of moral mission of the Rostra, which is so we do these retreats. And then the Rostra is this online community that we've started to keep up the practice. Even though it's ideal to meet in person, it's still better than nothing to have an online group where you're practicing speeches and you're going through certain rhetorical forms, you have debates, things like that. And the Rostra, by the way, is what the Romans called the platform that the speakers would stand on in the forum. But one of the kind of bigger moral missions that I want to see people do, and I want to try to contribute to this and give them maybe paradigms for this, is just recreating some of these men's in-person speaking experiences. And okay, maybe some of them could be mixed gender too, but I think there's something really special about getting guys together to talk serious issues and and just practice on a more regular basis and to just have those opportunities to get together and not just to talk about the latest meme or whatever is going on in politics that's just easy low-hanging fruit, but to set an agenda where you have somebody to give a toast. You say, all right, you're going to give a speech next week, like make it good. How are you going to make it good? Maybe you're going to talk about history and you tell a story, you know. And I think when you get guys together, it kind of raises the bar for bringing something interesting or funny or thought provoking. And we just don't have the bar raised for us rhetorically enough in our day. So I'd like to see a lot more of this, and I wanted to have more of it in my life. Is one of the reasons I created these things.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. I understand the sentiment. And it's yeah, I think it's addressing an unmet need that many of us are feeling these days. Um, so before we leave out, I want to just give you the opportunity to kind of do a broad pitch for your project as you conceptualize it. It's multifaceted. There's the retreat, the online program, the podcast. Maybe you've got some other stuff you could tell us about. Um, Why do people need this in their lives?
I think that our future really depends on us recovering a spirit of zeal in society, but it begins with the individual. And so I want to exhort people to take up that cultural sword lying in the gutter, the crown with their sword, the Napoleon thing, and and get familiar with the lives of great men of the past, not as hero worship, not as kind of trite revivals of simplistic old stories, but a kind of deep engagement with kind of the off the beaten path for us, but mainstays of Western culture. And if you just listen to The Cost of Glory, or if you just pick up a copy of Plutarch's Lives, you're on your way. But I do think that the way to engage more deeply and to build friendships around this is to create situations where you're sharing this with other people. Maybe it's informally, get together with some friends for dinner and try to elevate the bar a little bit. Or maybe you come on one of our retreats, or you try to start a men's speaking society. But really getting into the classical, not just the classical texts and figures, but the classical way of approaching this stuff, which is to make it alive again and to apply these lessons to your life, to apply these paradigms, to draw your own um, inferences about how Gaius Marius is like Trump, or who are the real Gracchi in our day, or how can we refound the state like Solon and Lycurgus, and and this is how you kind of revive zeal, because it's not just about us. I think it's about the next generation too, and having something to pass on. Really, I have kids. I have two girls and a boy on the way. Um, and That's a big part of what motivates me is now that I'm a father is like trying to hand off the torch, which is is definitely not being handed off by the intellectual establishment. Which is one of the reasons I left academia. I felt like we were just kind of failing in our stewardship of the great tradition. And I mean, this is just an essential part of like building an ambitious future. And I'd like to see more traditionalists get on, be a little open to to kind of tech and optimism, because we need more optimists. Because the only people who are going to make a good future are the optimists. So that's the big idea that I'm all about, and reviving the ancient spirit in modern leadership culture. And there are other people doing this, and if you are, also reach out to me. I know a bunch of them, and I'd love to get you connected. So there's a lot of work before us, but I think it starts with setting a good example for yourself. That's like the main ethical takeaway of living a life in zeal is, becoming yourself an object of emulation for somebody, which is a really kind of scary thing to think about. In my late 20s, I really just was horrified at the idea that anybody would be imitating me. And now, as a father, it's like you can't dodge that. So own it. But the earlier you own it, the better, right?
Yeah, and make yourself into someone worth emulating.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Alex, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. He's over at the Cost of Glory.
Really enjoyed it, Alex.